The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like mechanical wasps trapped in plastic casings. Katie Morrison had stopped noticing the sound 3 years ago, around the same time she'd stopped noticing most things: the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee, the cold stainless steel of the 4 stands, the weight of her own past pressing against her ribs. She moved through the pediatric wing of Oak Creek Memorial with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that invisibility was a kind of armor. The other nurses called her quiet. The doctors didn't call her anything at all. Her badge clattered softly against her collarbone as she bent over a 6-year-old's line, her hands moving with the practiced economy of someone who had inserted 10,000 of these before. The child barely flinched. Katie had a way of making pain seem manageable, not by denying it, but by meeting it with absolute competence. Steady hands. No hesitation. A voice that promised, "I have done this 1,000 times, and you will be fine." What no one at Oak Creek Memorial knew was that Katie's hands had held things far worse than 4 lines. They had held young soldiers' stomachs together during sandstorms that turned the world red. They had performed emergency resections in mud-floored compounds with nothing but field-grade morphine and prayer. They had compressed a boy's chest for 18 minutes while incoming fire screamed overhead, her body shielding his small frame, her hands refusing to stop until a medevac bird descended through the dust and scooped them both into its belly. That was 20 years ago. That boy had been 8 years old. She pulled a pair of combat boots from the bottom of her locker each morning before shift, worn leather the color of dried blood, laces still knotted from 2004. She kept them beneath her scrubs in a canvas tote that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded lettering. The mug itself sat on the break room counter, cracked along the rim, holding cold coffee she never finished. Nobody asked why she kept military boots in her locker at a pediatric ward. Nobody asked Katie Morrison anything, which was exactly how she needed it. The morning David Chen was admitted, the charge nurse didn't flag anything unusual. Triple amputee, IED blast, transferred from Walter Reed for extended care. The chart landed on Katie's station at 6:27 a.m. She read his age first, 28, and her hands went very still. Then she read his name, and something inside her chest shifted like tectonic plates. David Chen. 8 years old. Caught in crossfire. Helmand Province. 2004. She didn't move for 11 seconds. Her co-worker Miranda was already talking, already moving on to the next admission, already unaware that the world had just tilted. Katie's breathing remained steady, she controlled that, always had, but her vision had telescoped down to the single line on the chart, patient to room 412. Requesting trauma-informed care protocol. He was in the north wing, 3rd floor, last room before the corner. Katie's shift didn't officially start until 7 o'clock, but her feet were already moving. She found him awake, staring at the ceiling with the kind of focused emptiness that came from learning to live inside pain. His remaining arm was scarred in a way that suggested he'd been through more surgeries than most people experienced in a lifetime. The sheets around his lower body lay flat and wrong, the geometry of amputation etched into the hospital bed. He turned his head when she entered. His eyes went wide. Recognition flashed across his face like lightning. "Medic." His voice cracked slightly. You had your hair down. That day. You pulled me out when the building collapsed. You had this braid and he stopped, swallowing hard. I've been trying to find you for 20 years. I kept that image. You were the last thing I remembered before the halo took me. I made them check every hospital database, every veteran registry. I knew you were real, but you just disappeared. Katie pulled a chair closer to his bed and sat down without breaking eye contact. "Hello, David." It was the first time in 20 years she'd spoken her truth aloud to another human being. The words felt like stepping off a cliff. Over the next 18 hours, Katie watched Dr. Marcus Hargrove approach David Chen's care the way a politician approaches a press conference, with calculated confidence and zero interest in listening. Hargrove was the kind of physician who moved through hospitals the way generals moved through battlefields, with the weight of institutional certainty that made questions feel like insubordination. His family had donated the entire East Wing 6 years ago. His brother-in-law was on the hospital board. He carried himself like someone who had never been wrong. On Chen's third morning, Hargrove swept into the room with his entourage of residents trailing behind him like ducklings. Katie was adjusting Chen's pain medication. He was experiencing breakthrough pain every 90 minutes despite the current protocol when Hargrove announced he was discontinuing the increased dosing. The patient is developing an inappropriate dependence on opioids, Hargrove said, not looking at Chen. He was looking at his residents, speaking for their benefit. We need to establish better pain management through psychological resilience techniques rather than pharmaceutical escalation. Chen's breathing had already begun to accelerate. His remaining hand gripped the bed rail. Katie felt something cold and ancient wake up inside her chest, not anger, something older. Clarity. Dr. Hargrove. Her voice was quiet, which was how she'd trained herself to speak in 3 years of invisibility. But there was a different substance underneath the quiet now, something that made the residents glance at her. The patient's current pain trajectory suggests neuropathic involvement. The breakthrough pain every 90 minutes indicates the protocol isn't adequate. Psychological resilience won't address peripheral nerve damage from tissue loss. Hargrove turned to look at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. The residents waited for him to shut her down. This was the choreography of hospitals. Doctors spoke, nurses listened, the hierarchy remained vertical. Nurse Morrison. He said her name the way someone might identify an insect. I'll manage the pharmaceutical protocols. Your job is to implement them, not interpret them. Understood, Doctor, Katie said, and looked away to resume Chen's vitals. The measured breath. The single tear that didn't fall because she'd trained herself out of tears in 2005 in a compound in Sanjin Valley, while her spotter bled out in her arms. She blinked it back now and said nothing else. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 hours later, Hargrove found Katie at the nursing station. He looked at her over the counter like she was an interesting problem to solve. You know what? His voice had taken on the conversational tone of someone about to say something irreversible. I'm going to make a little wager with the floor staff. I'm betting $50 you won't make it through the week. He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who never expected to lose. The bleeding heart always quits when the work gets real. How long do you think you'll last, Morrison? 5 days? 3? The room went dead silent. The other nurses were watching. 2 residents had stopped moving. The EKG monitors continued their steady beeping, indifferent to the social calculus happening 3 feet away. Katie finished entering her note into the computer before turning to face him. 1 measured breath. Her hands flat on the desk. A good doctor would be ashamed to make his patient suffer because his nurse bruised his ego, she said quietly. But I don't think you'll find much to be ashamed of, Dr. Hargrove. His face went the color of a warning light. He turned and walked away without another word, but his exit was the kind of departure that made promises. The kind that said, you've just made this personal. Katie returned to Chen's room 15 minutes later. She had work to do. She had a patient to keep breathing. And 20 years of training had taught her that the most dangerous moments were always the ones that looked like they'd already ended. The cafeteria smelled like industrial gravy and something that might have been chicken. Katie carried her tray, a sandwich she wouldn't eat, coffee she'd already forgotten about, applesauce she'd grab for Chen later, through the lunch crowd of day-shift nurses. Her name tag read K. Morrison, RN, in letters small enough to disappear. She chose a table in the corner, away from the clusters of staffers who traded gossip like currency. 19 minutes until she had to be back on the pediatric floor. 19 minutes of silence. Dr. Hargrove entered from the opposite end of the cafeteria. He moved the way men with legacy money moved, shoulders squared, chin high, the kind of posture that said the room had been waiting for him to arrive. His white coat had been tailored. His Rolex caught the fluorescent light as he gestured toward a cluster of residents gathered near the coffee station. I'm telling you, she won't make it to Friday, his voice carried across the cafeteria, deliberate and loud. Bleeding heart types always crack. The quiet ones especially. They look noble right up until the moment they realize nobody respects them. He smiled at his audience. I'll make it interesting. $50 as the nurse in the corner quits within a week. Who's taking that action? 2 residents laughed. One looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Katie didn't look up from her sandwich. She'd heard worse in a convoy that got ambushed. She'd seen friends die in her arms in desert heat that made 98 degrees feel like a lie. A doctor's arrogance barely registered. She took a careful bite of the sandwich. Turkey and mustard. She chewed twice. Then she set it down. Hargrove was already moving, already making his way toward her table with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no. He walked like a predator recognizing wounded prey. You know what your problem is, sweetheart. He didn't wait for an answer. His hand came down hard against her tray. The coffee cup tumbled sideways. Applesauce went everywhere, a pale pink smear across the white paper plate, splattering onto her scrubs like a map of failure. The sandwich slid across the laminate table and fell to the floor with a sound that made 3 nurses turn to look. The cafeteria got very quiet. Katie didn't flinch. Didn't reach for a napkin. Didn't say anything at all. She sat completely still, watching the applesauce continue its slow descent down the edge of the table. 1 drop. Then another. The viscosity of humiliation moving at gravity's speed. Hargrove leaned back, satisfied. Your problem is you care too much about patients who don't deserve it. You bend rules. You question decisions made by people who actually went to medical school. And you look at me like you know better. He paused, let his voice get softer, more dangerous. You don't know better. You're a pediatric nurse. I'm a surgeon. There's a hierarchy here, and you're not on top of it. He left before she could respond. Not that she was going to respond. Katie reached for her napkin, white paper, cheap, the kind that dissolved if it got too wet, and began wiping the applesauce from her scrubs. Someone offered her paper towels. She nodded once, a thank you that carried no gratitude. Just acknowledgement of the offer and a silent request to be left alone. It took 8 minutes to clean up. The cafeteria had returned to its normal volume by the time she threw away the paper towels. The residents who'd laughed were already looking at their phones. The uncomfortable one was carefully not making eye contact. Nobody asked her if she was okay. Nobody ever did. Katie left the cafeteria at 12:46 p.m. She had 14 minutes to get back to the pediatric floor. Chen was in his room, arms braced against the sides of his wheelchair, working through some kind of physical therapy exercise. He was sweating. The stump of his left leg was bound in white gauze that had turned faintly gray at the edges. His face went blank when he saw her, then something like relief crossed it. You're back, he said. Shift started at 6 a.m. She glanced at his chart, vitals, medication log, pain scale that he'd marked at 7/10 3 hours ago. 7 out of 10, and nobody had authorized anything stronger than what he was already on. Hargrove's signature at the bottom of the page. Authorization denied for escalated pain management protocol. She didn't know Chen. Not really. She knew he was a staff sergeant with the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. She knew his chart said he'd been airlifted from a checkpoint 400 meters north of Sanjin Valley with traumatic amputation of both legs and severe shrapnel injuries to his torso. She knew he'd spent 6 weeks in a military hospital in Germany before being transferred stateside. She didn't know why she kept finding reasons to check on him, why his pain scale made her chest tighten, why she'd spent 2 hours researching improved pain management protocols for triple amputee patients. She definitely didn't know why when she looked at him, something in her bones remembered running. Hargrove appeared in the doorway at 2:13 p.m. carrying Chen's full medical chart, a thing of weight and consequence, 6 months of hospitalization documented in thick manila folders. He walked to the end of the bed and released it. The chart fell to the floor, papers scattering like leaves. Pages slid under the bed rail. One landed at Katie's feet. Pick that up, sweetheart, Hargrove said, and smiled. It was the smile that made it clear this wasn't about the chart. The smile was a ritual. A demonstration of power. A way of saying, look how far I can push you. Look how low you'll go. Katie knelt to gather the papers. Her hands moved on their own, training, not emotion. She collected each page with precision. Temperature logs, EKG readings, medication administration records, the signed consent for amputation surgery. She stacked them methodically, perfectly aligned. The kind of careful work that comes from having learned to move efficiently under pressure. Hargrove waited, still smiling, still watching. Waiting for tears or anger or that moment when composure cracked. Katie stood. She held the chart. She looked him directly in the eye and took one measured breath, in through her nose for 4 counts, out through her mouth for 6. She let a single tear escape, just one, and wiped it away without looking down, without breaking eye contact. A good doctor would be ashamed to make his patient suffer because his nurse bruised his ego, she said quietly. The words landed like a verdict. Hargrove's face went crimson, not angry crimson, but caught crimson. The color of a man realizing his authority was being questioned by someone he'd assumed would never talk back. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. You're on thin ice, he said finally. I'm aware, Katie replied. He left. But not before pulling his phone from his pocket and making a call as he walked down the hallway. She heard him asking for the hospital board president before the elevator doors closed. Katie returned Chen's chart to his bedside table and checked his vitals one more time. Blood pressure 138/82. Heart rate 94. O2 sat 96% on room air. Pain scale still at 7 out of 10. She wrote down the numbers in the margins of his chart. Documentation that he was in pain and that nobody was helping him. That was the moment his monitors started alarming. 2 days later, she'd be fired in front of cameras. But that wasn't the worst part yet. The cardiac monitor had been screaming for exactly 6 seconds when Katie heard the alarm cascade from Chen's room, that particular rhythm that meant the heart was filling with fluid instead of pumping blood, tamponade, the silent killer that surgeons sometimes missed when shrapnel fragmented into spaces no imaging could catch. She was 3 doors down restocking a supply cart when the sound registered, and her body moved before her mind caught up, years of field medicine overriding the muscle memory of 3 years playing quiet. The room was already chaos, a resident fumbling with a crash cart, 2 nurses frozen at the bedside, Chen's face the color of old pennies, oxygen saturation numbers plummeting across the monitor like a plane going down. Katie's presence changed the air pressure in the way it does when someone trained for impossible situations walks in without doubt. She didn't announce herself. She didn't ask permission. She just moved, her scrubs rustling like the sound of tactical gear settling into place, and the frozen nurses instinctively stepped back because they recognized something in her movements that transcended rank or title. 14-gauge angiocath. Sterile field. 1% lidocaine, she said, her voice dropped half an octave, stripped of every please and apology that had characterized 3 years of careful deference. The words weren't requests. They were coordinates for a mission. A resident tried to interject something about protocol, about waiting for the attending, but Katie was already prepping the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her hands moving with the terrible precision of someone who had done this on corpses still warm in desert sand. I said now. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle toward the heart, and the hiss of air escaping, that specific sound of pressure equalizing, filled the room like a held breath being released. Katie had done this in a cave by moonlight with a penlight clenched between her teeth. She had done this while rounds of incoming fire hammered the corrugated metal walls. She had done this on a boy who screamed until he lost consciousness, his chest caving like a bird's ribcage, and she had saved him then too. The monitor climbed. 75. 82. 88. The numbers ticked upward like a countdown reversing, like time folding back on itself, and Katie's hands didn't shake because hands that had held dying soldiers together didn't shake when it mattered. She monitored the fluid draining into the syringe, dark red mixed with clear, telling its own story about the fragment that had been waiting inside Chen's chest like a secret, and at 92% saturation she stepped back in one smooth motion, the crisis compressed into 45 seconds, the kind of compressed excellence that only happens when someone has already died 100 times in training and 10 times in the field. That's when Hargrove burst through the doors, surgical cap still in place, face prepared for the battle he expected to fight, only to find his adversary already standing over a stabilizing patient, pericardiocentesis complete, the draining syringe held in hands that belonged to someone he'd never actually known. The look on his face, that moment when a man realizes his authority has been rendered irrelevant by someone he'd decided was beneath notice, lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then his mouth opened. Then it closed. Then he looked at Katie's hands. The moment stretched thin. One of the residents was staring at Katie's forearms where the sleeves had ridden up during the procedure, at the pale white scars that tracked across her skin like a map of decisions made under fire. Another was watching her breathing, steady, controlled, the kind of calm that doesn't come from a single job but from accumulated survival. Katie's eyes met Hargrove's across the unconscious body of David Chen, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't look away. Something flickered in that space, a recognition, not of who she was, but of what she was. A soldier. Not a nurse who happened to serve. A soldier wearing scrubs. Then the walls of the room fell away, and Katie was back in Helmand Province, 2004, her spotter markers bleeding out in the dust beside her, the tourniquet already applied but the femoral artery damage too extensive, too catastrophic, and his eyes meeting hers with the kind of acceptance that comes when you've run out of options. She had held his hand while his blood soaked into the earth, while incoming fire walked across the compound, while she made the decision to move to the next casualty because that was the calculus of war, you saved who you could save, and you carried the weight of the rest forever. Marcus had squeezed her hand once. "Get out of here, Chief," he'd said, which was his way of saying he was already gone, and Katie had done what she always did. She'd moved on to the next one. Chen's hand found hers now, his eyes fluttering open, confused and in pain but alive, and the present reasserted itself like a slap. Katie's breathing was still controlled. Her hands were still steady. The only thing that betrayed her was the brief flicker of something across her face, the ghost of Helmand, the weight of everyone she couldn't carry anymore, the burden that had driven her to hide in a small hospital in Raleigh and tell no one, not her sister, not a single soul, where she'd gone or what she'd left behind. "You're okay," she told Chen quietly, and the voice that emerged was the one that had given orders in 3 languages, that had called in air support, that had made life and death decisions at 24 years old. "Cardiac tamponade. Fragment from the original injury. You're stable now. The surgeons can get the rest." Hargrove was still standing in the doorway, his authority crumbling in real time, and Katie didn't spare him a glance as she began documenting the procedure with precision, vital signs, timeline, exact measurements, the way someone trained to submit reports for military review documented their work. She wrote down times that would make perfect sense to anyone who understood tactical operations, who understood that 45 seconds under pressure required training measured in years. The room around her had gone very quiet. Not the silence of shock, though there was that too. The silence of recognition. Of doors closing on assumptions. Of people beginning to ask questions they didn't yet have context to answer, about the nurse in the pediatric wing who moved like a soldier, who spoke in commands, whose hands had just performed a procedure that belonged in textbooks, not in the steady fingers of someone who was supposed to be fetching bedpans and organizing supply carts. What happened next would be documented in medical records and reported to the hospital board and eventually placed in the hands of people who specialized in finding the disappeared. But for now, in the fluorescent-lit silence of Chen's room, Katie was simply wiping her hands on a surgical towel, her movements deliberate and calm, while the man she'd carried out of enemy fire lay breathing steadily in a hospital bed and looked at her with new understanding in his eyes. He knew. Not who, not yet. But he knew that the woman standing beside his bed was more than what she had allowed anyone to see, and in the way that recognition travels between soldiers, wordlessly, immediately, across decades and continents, he understood that he owed his life to someone who had already saved him once, and never told him her name. The monitors showed green across the board. Sinus rhythm. Stable. Chen's oxygen saturation climbed, 88, 92, 96. His eyes fluttered open just as Hargrove burst through the trauma bay doors, scrub cap still in his hand, his face already flushed with the knowledge that he'd arrived to find someone else commanding his room. Katie stepped back from the bed without a word. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the air, the moment when a man realizes his authority has been suspended in amber, crystallized at the exact second he stopped mattering. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. He looked at Chen on the stretcher, at the cardiac monitor showing steady rhythm, at the lines running from the young Marine's chest that hadn't been there 15 minutes ago. What did you do? His voice was low. Dangerous in a way that only threatened people ever sounded. Katie was already removing her gloves, the latex snapping like gunshots in the controlled silence of the room. Your patient needed intervention. He got it. You performed a procedure you are not authorized. His heart stopped. Katie moved past him toward the sink. Her hands ran under water that was too hot, the kind that burned without hurting. Would you have preferred I wait? He didn't answer. He couldn't. The evidence was written across Chen's stabilizing vitals, across the equipment on the tray beside the bed, across the simple fact that the Marine was breathing and would keep breathing because someone in this hospital knew what they were doing. Hargrove turned on his heel and walked out, and Katie saw something in that exit that she recognized from 20 years ago in Helmand Province, the moment when a man's mind starts calculating how to make you disappear. She dried her hands on a paper towel and didn't let her hands shake until she was alone in the supply closet 3 minutes later. Even then, she didn't cry. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. They just stand very still in the dark and remember that this exact calculation, this moment of being marked, was exactly why she'd walked away. By 6:53 a.m., Hargrove had made 4 phone calls from his office. The hospital board president answered on the second ring, voice thick with sleep and irritation. Hargrove's tone shifted the moment he heard that irritation. He became smaller, more solicitous, the voice of a man with a problem that required handling by people with more power than he possessed. Sir, we have a situation with one of the nursing staff. A matter of protocol violation and scope of practice that the board should be aware of. The second call went to a temp agency in Chapel Hill. I need employment history on Katie Morrison. She used you as a reference. And I need it now. The third call was to an outside medical investigator based in Durham, a man Hargrove had met at a golf outing 3 years ago, a man who understood that hospitals sometimes needed problems audited into existence. I want every chart she's touched in the past 36 months reviewed for deviations. Particularly anything involving emergency interventions. The fourth call was harder. It was to his brother-in-law, who sat on the hospital board and whose son Hargrove had helped get into UNC medical school. Can we talk before the meeting? There's a nurse situation that needs board-level attention. By 8:13 a.m., the outside investigator was already in the medical records department, pulling files with the efficient precision of someone who'd done this before. By 9:22 a.m., Hargrove had printed 17 pages of notes. By 10:38 a.m., the hospital board president had called an emergency personnel review meeting. By noon, Katie Morrison had been called to the administrator's office, shown a file full of procedure violations, scope of practice concerns, and unauthorized emergency interventions, and informed that her employment was terminated effective immediately for failure to comply with hospital protocol. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She simply nodded, removed her badge from around her neck, it hung from a thin blue lanyard with a name that wasn't hers printed on it, and set it on the mahogany desk. I understand, she said. It wasn't a request. It was a command to herself. The walk to her locker took 3 minutes. She'd been working at Oak Creek Memorial for 3 years and had accumulated almost nothing. A spare set of scrubs. 3 pairs of compression socks. A greeting card someone had given her after she'd stayed late to help with a pediatric admission. It was from a mother, thanking her. Katie left that behind. She took the cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" that had come from a white elephant exchange. She took the dying succulent on the top shelf, its leaves brown and papery, something she'd been keeping alive out of sheer stubbornness. And from the very bottom of the locker, beneath everything else, she pulled out a photograph creased at the corners from years of being carried in different pockets, different lives. Marcus. Her spotter. 22 years old in the photo, grinning at the camera with the expression of a man who had no idea his time was already measured in months. She placed all 3 items in a cardboard box from the supply room. The mug rattled against the sides. The succulent shed a single leaf. The rain outside the ER entrance was heavy, the kind of rain that fell in sheets and made the world dissolve into watercolor abstractions. Katie didn't run. She walked at a measured pace, the box balanced on one hip, her scrub soaked through in seconds. The parking garage was 3 blocks away, but she didn't go there. She went instead to the bus stop on Fayetteville Street, the one near the corner deli, the one where she'd been getting coffee for 3 years and the barista never charged her for the second cup. The bench was wet. She sat down anyway. 2:51 a.m. Not a.m. That wasn't right. 2:51 p.m. The afternoon was dark as evening. The rain hammered the pavement in a rhythm like applause from a crowd that knew she'd just failed. Again. She'd saved Chen's life. Twice. 20 years apart. And both times it had cost her everything. The first time, she'd been 28 years old, running through Helmand Province with a rifle in one hand and a bleeding 8-year-old Marine in the other. She'd carried him 3 kilometers through open fire, through a world that was trying to kill him, and she'd gotten him to the landing zone just as the Black Hawk touched down. He'd lived. She'd disappeared into the war and never told him her name. The second time, she was 54 years old and had become small enough that nobody saw her coming. She'd spent 3 years becoming invisible, and for one moment in a trauma bay, she'd been visible again. And now she was invisible in a different way. She was gone. Katie opened the box and pulled out the photograph of Marcus. His face had faded in the years she'd carried him. The Kodak paper had turned sepia at the edges. She held it in both hands, his face, his last moment on Earth when he was alive and grinning and had no idea. "I'm sorry," she said to the photograph. "I tried again and I failed again." The rain fell harder. She thought about dropping the box into the gutter, letting it soak until the photograph dissolved into nothing, until the mug shattered under a bus tire, until the succulent turned to mud. She thought about walking away from the cardboard box and never looking back, just like she'd done in Helmand when she'd left her combat boots at a forward operating base and disappeared. But she didn't. Instead, she set the photograph carefully back in the box. She reached down and touched the sole of the mug with one finger. It was still whole. The succulent had survived this long by refusing to die, just like everything else she'd ever carried. She closed her eyes and pressed her palms against them until she saw stars, until the ache behind her eyes was all that was left of the person she'd been. She'd been waiting for punishment. She'd been waiting for someone to finally see what she'd done, who she'd been, and make her pay. Instead, she'd been allowed to hide. And then, when she'd finally acted, when she'd used every skill she'd learned, every instinct, every hour of training, the world had called it insubordination. Katie opened her eyes and looked up at the rain. It fell on her face without hesitation, without mercy, without asking permission. And that was when she heard it. At first, she thought it was part of the rain. A pressure change in the air. A sound so low it registered in her bones before her ears could process it. But it grew louder, closer, sharpening into something that made every person on Fayetteville Street stop and look up. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through wet air. The helicopter descended through the rain clouds like a metal angel, rotors cutting the Raleigh air into submission. Katie didn't look up from the bus stop bench. She'd learned long ago that some sounds belonged to other people's lives. The cardboard box sat beside her, its corners softening in the downpour, the photograph of Marcus just barely visible beneath a cracked mug. 12 years since his blood had soaked into the dust of Helmand Province. 7 hours since she'd been fired for saving a man's life. The Black Hawk's shadow crossed Fayetteville Street. Nurses stood in the ER bay doors, staring upward. The aircraft banked hard toward Oak Creek Memorial's rooftop landing pad, and Katie finally looked. Something in the way it moved, precision, purpose, the muscle memory of 1,000 combat insertions, made her chest tighten. That wasn't a rescue helicopter. That was a military bird. That was Saw. That was her world, coming back to collect its debts. She didn't move. Inside Oak Creek Memorial, in room for 12, a man with dark eyes and missing legs was trying to stand on prosthetics that weren't responding to his commands. David Chen had been staring at the visitor's chair for 3 hours now, at the pair of worn combat boots placed carefully on its seat, their laces still tied the way a soldier ties them. Not like a civilian. Like someone who expects to put them on again in 30 seconds if the alarm sounds. A nurse had brought the boots in with an elderly patient 2 hours ago. Frail. Agitated. Speaking Pashto with an accent that made the translators uncomfortable. "Where is she?" he kept asking. "The woman with the dark braid. The one who ran into fire." The staff had explained that Katie was gone, terminated, but the old man had become so distressed that his oxygen saturation dropped to 88% and his heart rate spiked to 112. They'd sedated him, parked him in room for 10, and left the boots on the chair next to Chen's bed. Now Chen was staring at those boots like they were a message written in a language only he understood. His hand shook as he reached for them. The leather was scarred from 1,000 operations. The heel was worn down on the left side, the dominant foot of someone who'd spent years moving in tactical formation, weight favoring the rear leg for faster reaction time. Inside the left boot, faded by sweat and time, was a call sign stitched in surgical thread, "Breach." Chen's breath came in shallow pulls. Breach. That was the medic's name. That was the woman who'd pulled him out of the crossfire in Sanjin Valley where he was 8 years old and bleeding out from shrapnel. That was the voice that had said, "I've got you, son. You're going home. You're going home." That was the woman who'd disappeared into the mountains and never came back, and he'd kept these boots for 20 years, rotating them into his pack on every deployment, searching every base for someone who matched her description. And yesterday, that same woman had saved his life again. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical prayer as Chen pressed the boots against his chest. The old man in 410 was mumbling in Pashto, something about fire and courage and a face that haunted his nights for decades. The interpreter had said he was Taliban. Former Taliban. Defected. Been searching for her too. Searching for Breach. Chen grabbed his phone. His hands moved on instinct, dialing the emergency line he'd been given when he'd transferred to Oak Creek, the number that connected directly to the senior liaison officer for all military personnel receiving care in the VA system. "Commander Price," the voice answered. Crisp. Professional. "Sir," Chen said. His voice sounded very young, very far away. "I need you to contact the Pentagon. Right now. Tell them you found her. Tell them you found Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison." The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then, "Who am I speaking to?" "Staff Sergeant David Chen. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Bravo Company. She carried me out of Helmand Province in 2004 when I was 8 years old. She just saved my life again yesterday, and you need to know she's here." The line went dead for a moment. Then noise, multiple voices, paper shuffling, someone shouting orders into another phone. When Price came back, his voice had shifted into something Katie would have recognized immediately. Command voice. The tone used when moving chess pieces that cost millions of dollars. "Stand by, Staff Sergeant. Do not move from that location." 6 hours later, the hospital lobby had been transformed into something between a news conference and a military invasion. 17 Navy SEALs in dress uniform stood in formation along the east wall, their bearings so rigid they seemed to compress the air around them. 3 FBI agents flanked the main entrance, badges visible. Local news cameras crowded the atrium, their operators jockeying for better angles. The hospital board members sat in a line of folding chairs, looking like they'd been swallowed by events larger than their institutional capacity to contain. Katie stood in the back, near the pediatric ward entrance, still in her hospital scrubs. Chen's hand gripped hers with the strength of someone who'd spent 20 years in tactical training, and it did not let go. Commander Price stepped to the microphone. He was 6 feet 2 inches of naval authority, his uniform covered in decorations that caught the light like a weather system. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of things that happened on continents nobody wanted to think about. Katie Morrison was enrolled in the Navy as a medic in 1998, Price began. She completed special warfare training in 2000. From 2002 until 2012, she served in combat operations across 3 continents. During her service, she was decorated for extraordinary valor. She saved the lives of 43 military personnel. She turned an enemy asset who provided intelligence that accelerated the end of combat operations in Helmand Province. She earned the trust of the United States military's most elite operators. And 7 years ago, she walked away from all of it. No forwarding address. No communication. The Pentagon has been searching for her continuously since her disappearance. Price paused. His eyes found Katie in the back of the room. For a moment, the authority softened into something else, respect, maybe. Or grief. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, Price continued, on this date, I am here to formally recognize your service record and present you with the following decorations. He nodded to the SEAL next to him, who stepped forward holding a wooden case. Bronze Star. The case opened. The ribbon gleamed under the hospital lights like liquid sapphire. Price's voice remained steady, but something ancient and ceremonial had entered the room. Silver Star. Another case. Another ribbon, brighter than the first. The news cameras swung toward Katie, catching her profile, her absolute stillness. She did not blink. She did not move. She simply stood there while her wars were catalogued in front of strangers. Second Silver Star. The room shifted. Murmurs rippled through the gathered officers. 2 silver stars meant something specific. It meant operations so dangerous that most operators didn't survive them. It meant the kind of valor that changed how people understood the meaning of the word. Purple Heart. Case. Ribbon. The color of blood and remembrance. And, Price said, and his voice dropped lower, more intentional, the Navy Cross. The silence that followed was absolute. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration a person could receive. It was given for extreme gallantry under fire. For actions that transcended normal understanding of courage. The only award higher was the Medal of Honor, and those came with a 10-foot radius of reverence that made the air itself seem to pause. Dr. Hargrove stood from his chair near the middle of the room. His face had gone from red to white, the color draining as if someone had opened a valve in his chest and let all his authority pour onto the tile floor. He opened his mouth. Closed it. His hand shook as he reached for his phone. Dr. Hargrove, Price's voice cracked like a whip, not even looking at him. Sit down. Hargrove Saturday. Price turned back to Katie. The Pentagon has been searching for you for 2,555 days, he said. We did not know if you were alive. We did not know if you wanted to be found. But we never stopped looking. Senior Chief, will you return to active duty? Katie's hand tightened in Chen's. When she spoke, her voice came from somewhere much deeper than her throat. It came from the place where she'd buried everything that made her dangerous. No, sir. The word hung there. Simple. Final. Every camera in the room caught her face as she said it, and something about her composure, the absolute absence of effect, the way she delivered a denial to the most powerful military forces in the world while still holding the hand of a soldier she'd saved twice, seemed to shatter something in Hargrove's understanding of how authority worked. She performed procedures outside her scope of practice. Hargrove suddenly shouted, standing again, his voice cracking. I have documentation. I have? You have nothing, Price said quietly. He turned to the hospital board president. Dr. Hargrove's employment is terminated as of this moment. Effective immediately. This hospital, by order of the Department of Defense, will be under investigation for breach of contract and willful endangerment of military personnel. You'll cooperate fully, or your Medicare and Medicaid funding will be revoked within 48 hours. It took 19 minutes for security to escort Dr. Hargrove from the building. They walked him past the assembled SEALs, past the FBI agents, past the news cameras. They walked him past Katie, who was still standing in her scrubs while the military's highest honors lay in cases beside her. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old milk. His eyes avoided hers completely, darting from side to side like an animal searching for an exit that didn't exist. When he was gone, Katie's trembling started. Not fear. Not breaking. Restraint. Pure restraint, the physical manifestation of holding together everything that wanted to collapse, to scream, to finally stop pretending that she was just a nurse with a cracked mug and a photograph of someone she couldn't save. Chen's hand held tighter. "I've got you, Senior Chief," he whispered, and it was the same tone he'd heard in Helmand Province 20 years ago. The same voice that had promised her he would survive. "You're going home. You're going home." 18 months later, Katie Morrison received a newspaper clipping forwarded to her at the VA hospital where she now worked, not as a director, not in an office, but in the trauma bay where the broken came to learn that some people still knew how to put them back together. The clipping was from a Raleigh Community College newsletter. Dr. Stephen Hargrove was teaching CPR certification classes at $18 per hour, the bio line said. His name tag at the community college urgent care clinic read Steve. Former nurses who'd worked with him reported that he flinched whenever anyone called him doctor. Katie pinned the clipping above her desk, next to her shadow box. In the box, a photograph of David Chen as an 8-year-old, taken before the war, her combat boots, finally retired, and a Navy Cross ribbon that caught the morning light like evidence of someone who'd learned that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding everything together. She didn't take the director's position. She didn't want the office or the authority or the organizational chart with her name at the top. What she wanted was this, a stretcher rolling in at 2:17 a.m. A soldier who couldn't remember how to breathe. Her hands moving, muscle memory and training becoming prayer, the certainty that comes from having already survived the worst. The knowledge that somewhere on her floor, someone was learning that they would live. That they would go home. That there was still someone left who remembered how to carry them there. Sometimes an older medic from the 75th Ranger Regiment would come through the ER, or broken ribs, lacerations, the kind of injuries that came from refusing to leave people behind. He'd see Katie and stop, recognition crossing his face like lightning. "Your breach," he'd say. It was never a question. "Just a nurse now," she'd answer. "No," he'd say, "you're not." And he'd be right. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Like and subscribe if you love stories about people who've been underestimated. Comment below if you've ever had someone doubt you and you proved them wrong. Let's get back to it.